بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum. Our topic today inshallah will be very brief, especially in light of the recent incidents in Egypt. So we would like to shift our focus in the next few days inshallah to Egypt. However, discussing the Turkish model is relevant, as the brother mentioned. And the way we are going to discuss the Turkish model inshallah ta'ala is by employing the method of political analysis. What is political analysis? Or to be more specific, what does it mean to analyze something? التحليل السياسي. التحليل السياسي, political analysis means to deconstruct a particular reality, a particular event, a particular phenomenon, right? In order to understand its components, and then subsequently you reconstruct, right, those components in order to reach a certain understanding, right, a certain analysis. So when we say al-tahleel, we mean al-tafkik, not al-tafsir. Al-tafsir is to reconstruct. Al-tahleel siyasi means to deconstruct a particular phenomena so that we can understand it. And this is a very objective process, meaning that when you carry out any sort of political analysis, you put all your ideological commitments to the side, whether you are a liberal, a socialist, a Marxist, a quote-unquote Islamist, and so forth, and you try to analyze the particular phenomenon which you are dealing with. You try to analyze and understand the subject matter. So that's why what we are going to do today, inshallah ta'ala, is I'm going to put all my intellectual affiliations, any presumptions I have on the side, whether those are presumptions based on affiliation with Hizb al-Tahrir, Ittihad, and so forth. That's one. This is what political analysis is. Two, political analysis dictates that we look at the actions, right, and the policies involved, and not the rhetoric or the ideology, right? If you want to understand a particular phenomenon, you have to look at the mu'tayat, the given realities, right? Whereas rhetoric, for example, can be used to cover up certain actions and so forth. So our subject matter in analyzing the Turkish model will be the actions and policies of the AKP and of Prime Minister Erdogan. And of course, another critical point to note, when we analyze politics or analyze any political phenomena, especially when dealing with political figures and phenomena such as the AKP, is that we have to differentiate between two things, right? And this differentiation is necessary if you want to successfully understand any phenomena, is that we have to differentiate between good intentions and bad policies. Meaning that today we're not discussing Erdogan, right, by virtue of him being a Muslim brother. We're discussing Erdogan by virtue of him being the Prime Minister of Turkey and as the head of the AKP, right? So we're not discussing the intention. This is not we have no interest in doing so. What we're doing is we're discussing the policies objectively of the AKP so that we can try to understand what is the Turkish model, right? And is the Turkish model sustainable? So again, from the very beginning, I'm going to put all my ideological assumptions to the side. I'm not going to ask whether this system is legitimate or illegitimate, this model. Nor am I going to ask, is it Islamic or un-Islamic? Or is it in conformity with what I believe to be a legitimate mode of governance, the caliphate or not? I'm going to put these to the side. So I'm going to begin with talking about, inshallah, the origins of the Turkish model, or what came to become known as the Turkish model. In the late 1990s, there was a rift within the Islamist movement in Turkey. There were certain factions which began to break off of the movement led by Erdogan, right? The Welfare Party and other parties and so forth. One of these break-offs was the AKP, which was founded in 2001. And from the very beginning, the AKP and Erdogan made it very clear that they are not an Islamic movement. They are not an Islamic party. And this is made explicitly clear in their opening statement and in their manifesto and in their early press conferences. Instead, they adopted two main ideologies: social conservatism and economic liberalism. Okay, social conservatism and economic liberalism. And therefore, the AKP is very similar to the Christian democratic parties in Europe, and more specifically in Germany. And this social conservatism and this economic liberalism and this drift from Islamic politics was very clear from the onset. When, for example, one of the first policies of the AKP was to support the nullification of the ban on adultery, or I'm sorry, the law against adultery. In Turkey, there was a law against adultery. Yeah. So, as per request from the European Union, right, because Turkey is seeking membership in the European Union, there was one of the criteria was that Turkey removes a particular law, and this was the law against adultery. The AKP was one of the first parties to campaign for the nullification of this law, right? Again, from the very beginning, they wanted to make it clear that they had foregone the Islamist baggage of Erbakan and so forth. This is in terms of its social and political policies. On the economic front, it had a whole new program for Turkey. What it wanted is it wanted to take Turkey from being a stable domestic economy with a strong manufacturing base to an economy which is open to the liberal market economy, right? And to do so, the AKP employed what we call aggressive capitalism. Aggressive capitalism, to the extent that they even refused to be parts of any other sort of economic networks. For example, in 2002, there was an economic summit, an economic conference in Jeddah. And there was a proposal that the Muslim countries, Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, and so forth, create a network, or right, a Muslim market. The same way you have, for example, the same way the European Union has a market, the same way Latin America has its own market, right, certain economic deals. There was a proposal to create an Islamic or a Muslim market between the Muslim countries. The biggest opponent to this proposal was Erdogan, right, and his argument was that we should not have any sort of market model or any sort of economic model based on with any religious basis or with any ideological basis. While on the other hand, we know that he was pursuing membership, right, into the EU, which has a purely secular basis and purely Eurocentric groundwork. So this is in regards to the history and the ideology of the AKP and of Erdogan. As we said, it becomes very clear from the onset, just by looking at their policies from the very beginning, that it was not an Islamist movement, independently of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. It followed a policy of economic liberalism, and it continues to do so, and social conservatism, conservative democracy. Now, in terms of the functions of the AKP, on an international level, right, we already spoke on an internal level. On an international level, in order to understand what is the function of the AKP, we need to understand what is the grand strategy, right, or the political framework which governs the Middle East to begin with. And then we can understand what is the context and the role of the AKP and of the quote-unquote Turkish model within this grand strategy. From the very beginning, right, the political modes of governance, the political structures which govern the Middle East and North Africa are those of colonialism, right, are those of colonialism. And this is by virtue of the functions and the ideological functions of the West's political system, which is capitalism, right? The constant need for perpetual resources and expansion and so forth. So the fixed method and the fixed grand strategy which is employed in the Muslim world, in the Arab Muslim world, is that of colonialism. However, colonialism takes different faces, right? Colonialism takes different forms, different shapes. And colonialism shifted into a new phase, right? A new cloak shortly after 9/11, right? And let's discuss this briefly, inshallah, so we can discuss what is the Turkish model, because this is the essential gist of the lecture. When the British and the French and the Italians and Russians, right, colonized the British and the French colonized the Muslim world, right? Shortly after the military colonization, it became very clear that the military presence of the French and the British was unsustainable. Why? Because it was creating antagonism. It was creating popular unrest, civil strife, and so forth. So they had to adopt a new form of colonialism. So they shifted from military colonialism to political colonialism, meaning instead of having British and French officers, right, administer the affairs of of the French and British Mandate, you had people by the name of Hosni, Abdullah, Muhammad, and so forth. So different faces, right? But same policies. It's what Frantz Fanon called black faces, white masks. All they did was they put on a mask. However, this second phase of political colonialism led to the emergence of authoritarian regimes, right? The military authoritarian regimes, which we see now, which were overthrown in many parts of the Muslim world, or supposedly overthrown. However, we saw that this was not necessarily the case. But what happened was, because these politicians, right, and these political elite, these colonial elite, or what we can call the native elites, had a very alien discourse, a very Eurocentric discourse, there was a sort of gap, this sort of bifurcation between the elites and between the masses. So instead of there being an ideological harmony between the state and the people, the state had to resort to coercion, having mass security apparatuses, and so forth. And again, the function of colonialism, we should have discussed this earlier, was obviously to provide security for the colonial West. One, the provision of security and not just raw material, and two, preserving the colonial identity of the natives, whether it's identity of the nation state and so forth, tribalism, nationalism, and whatnot. So the preservation, the provision of security, the provision of raw materials, and the preservation of the colonial identity which is imposed upon the Muslim world. So after the emergence of these authoritarian regimes, Western political elite, including, for example, the Bush administration, came to conclude that this is not working. These authoritarian regimes, these colonial regimes, are not providing security, and they're not providing stability. As a matter of fact, these authoritarian regimes are propelling and perpetuating the process of radicalization. That is why, for example, you see states like Saudi Arabia, right? 15 of the 19 hijackers from 9/11 came from Saudi Arabia, an ally of the United States. One came from Egypt, another ally of the United States. One came from Lebanon, another ally of the United States, and so forth. So it became very clear that this authoritarian model of colonialism was not working. So as of 2003, there was the emergence and discussion of a new model, a new colonial model, and it became known as the Greater Middle East Initiative, right? The Greater Middle East Initiative. It was later called the Broader Middle East and North Africa Initiative. And the idea behind this was, and this was formulated, it was formulated over a period of a decade, but it was openly articulated by Condoleezza Rice and by the Bush administration, that what we need to do is that we need to domesticate democracy, right? We need to domesticate secularism, and we need to give, in other words, we need to give colonialism a makeover, so that colonialism, right, is in harmony with the sensitivities, the religious and cultural sensitivities of the Arab Muslim world, right? And to do so, to promote this model, obviously they had to seek partnerships in the Middle East. Now, it was around this time, around 2003, right, when the AKP came to power. And the AKP, right, the AKP's foreign policy was in direct conformity with the Greater Middle East Initiative. Because the very idea of the Greater Middle East, the gist and the core of the AKP's foreign policy was soft power. The difference between soft power and hard power. Hard power is when you use economic sanctions and military force and so forth, right? This is hard power. Soft power is when you use diplomacy, ideology, institutions. So immediately there was a harmony between the AKP's foreign policy, right, which was articulated by the strategist Ahmed Dawood and the United States Greater Middle East Initiative, right? And the first pillar of the foreign policy for the AKP was the idea of promoting democracy without risking security and stability, i.e. providing the West with security, but at the same time providing real democracy, i.e. the cultural and the political stability needed to quell violence, to quell the emergence of terrorism, and so forth. So the U.S., as we saw, was seeking to adopt this policy of this inclusionary policy, this policy of containing Islam within the political systems, within the democratic process, and this was exactly what the Turkish model was promoting. Paul Wolfowitz, I'm sorry, he's a neoconservative ideologue, and he's the Deputy Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. He puts it this way, right? The strategy: to win the war against terrorism, and in doing so shape a more peaceful world, i.e. for the West, we must reach out to the hundreds of millions of moderates and tolerant people in the Muslim world. We must speak to those people around the world who aspire to enjoy the blessings of freedom and free enterprise. Free enterprise meaning liberal market economy, right? And then he goes on to say, Turkey offers a compelling demonstration that these values of liberal democracy, are compatible with modern society, right? That, in other words, that religious beliefs do not need to be sacrificed to build modern democratic institutions. And similar statements were made by Hillary Clinton and even Barack Obama. This policy was continued by Barack Obama, and Barack Obama openly stated, right, that the Turkish model is a model which the Muslims should follow after the Arab Spring. And Erdogan put it even more explicitly. Erdogan says, Turkey and its region, and especially in the Middle East, will be a guide in overcoming instability, a driving economic force for economic development, i.e. driving aggressive capitalism, and this is the important part, and a reliable partner in ensuring security, right, i.e. remaining a colonial state. It goes on to say, I do not claim, of course, that Turkey's experience is a model that can be implemented identically, right? It cannot be generalized in all its components in all other Muslim societies. However, the Turkish experience does have a substance which can serve as a source of inspiration for other Muslim societies and other Muslim people. And like I mentioned Dawood Oglu earlier, right? He's the foreign affairs advisor to. He was the foreign affairs advisor to the AKP. He also announced it very clearly in a press conference where he said that Turkey and Egypt, right, but we see the Egyptian model collapse in the past few days, and the Turkish model is collapsing, as we will see. The Turkish model and the Egyptian model are examples of why the Greater Middle East Initiative can be successful in the Arab world in the post-Arab Spring. So Dawood Oglu openly expressed and openly made it clear, right, that the Turkish model is part of the Greater Middle East Initiative, i.e. the preservation of coloniality, the preservation of the colonial system in the Muslim world, the Sykes-Picot paradigm, but under a new, more friendly Muslim face, right? This is not to mention Turkey's geopolitical importance, right? Because Turkey lies between the Middle East and Eastern Europe. So it is both geographically and ideologically a bridge between the East and the West, between the Muslim world and Europe. And in some ways in which, for example, Erdogan pursued this policy of promoting democratization and the continuation of colonial interests and so forth, was, for example, if you want to just examine his rhetoric, this is putting all his policies to the side, yeah? If you want to just look at some of the open statements which Erdogan has made, was, for example, shortly after Hamas won in the elections in Gaza, right, and dominated the legal institutions in Gaza, he openly called upon Hamas to embrace the two-state solution with Israel and to formally recognize Israel's existence. More so, after the Arab Spring, Erdogan had a tour, right, of the Middle East and North Africa, and this included Egypt and Tunis. And interestingly enough, he was greeted, right, by thousands of supporters, thousands of Muslim Brotherhood supporters in Egypt's, in Cairo's airport and in Tunis. And the chant was, actually, this is very ironic, that the chant was, while they were greeting Erdogan, something like, Turkiya wa Masr aizinha khilafa Islamiyya, right? This was their chant while they were welcoming Erdogan. Egyptians and the Turks, we want a caliphate, right? We want an Islamic state. Why? Because for them, Erdogan represented Islam, represented a Muslim leader, and so forth. However, to the surprise of many, one of the first things he did was he criticized the Muslim Brotherhood, right, during his visit, and he openly called upon the Muslim Brotherhood to embrace secularism and to embrace a more secular constitution. He made this call, right, he made this statement both in both in Egypt and in Tunis. And of course, their Muslim brother responded very critically, saying that he should not interfere in their internal affairs and so forth. And of course, this was met with popular criticism. And if you want to know more about the role of the AKP in the Greater Middle East Initiative or in the neo-colonial policies of the Western world, it would suffice to look at the RAND report. RAND, we all know RAND is a US think tank. There was a study which was funded by the Pentagon, by the Defense Department, by the Secretary of Defense, entitled "The Political Islam in Turkey." So this is a 128-page document which clearly outlines the importance of the US-Turkish alliance in quelling terrorism in the Arab world, in marginalizing radicalism, and in promoting a more liberal Muslim state. Now, part 3. After having discussed this, what are the pillars of Turkey's popularity? Why is Turkey so popular? Why is the Turkish model so popular? There are two general pillars. One, Erdogan's rhetoric and charisma, right? Erdogan's rhetoric and charisma. Two, the economic success, internally and externally. The so-called economic miracle of Turkey has been a source of popularity for the Arab Muslim world after the Arab Spring. And interestingly enough, the Turkish model in and of itself, ideologically, is not popular in the Muslim world. Not many people know what it is. If you were to ask a Muslim, an average Muslim, what is the Turkish model, very few people know what it is exactly. But ask them, who is Erdogan? They say, oh, right, he is a Muslim leader. He is a charismatic Muslim leader. So the popularity of Turkey, or the Turkish model, stems more from the personality of Erdogan than the quote-unquote Islamic credentials of the Turkish model. So why are these unsustainable pillars for popularity? Quite simply because when an ummah rallies around leaders who take stances, like for example Hassan Nasrallah after 2006, there were protests around the Muslim world, in Egypt, Tunis, Iran and so forth, carrying pictures of Hassan Nasrallah after the so-called victory in 2006 against Israel, right after the devastating impact of the war on the south and in the suburbs and so forth. And for example, Jamal Abdel Nasser also. Why? Because they both took stances against Israel. They both took certain strong positions, right, which the Ummah admired, which the Muslim world admired. And similarly, this is what Erdogan did, right? Give or take, it was rhetoric. For example, in 2002, I believe, in the World Economic Forum with Shimon Peres, right, where he got up and he left. Although nothing changed in his military policy or economic policies towards Israel, everything remained the same. Also, when there was the Gaza flotilla incident, right, with the boat carrying aid to Gaza when it was attacked by Israel, similarly, Erdogan's position towards Israel and his rhetoric and discourse was very stern. And there's many other examples. For example, during the Syrian revolution, early on in the Syrian revolution, Erdogan's stance towards Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime was also very stern. So the rhetoric and the charisma of Erdogan provided the Ummah a sort of inspiration. However, the question is, what happens to the Turkish model after Erdogan is gone? Right? What happens to the Turkish model after Erdogan is gone? And what happens to the Turkish model of soft power after its key strategist, Ahmed Davutoglu, is also gone? Right? In other words, the sustainability of the Turkish model's popularity relies on Erdogan's charisma, and therefore it is largely unstable. And it's all the more unstable because the benchmark of the Ummah is slowly rising, meaning that following the bloody continuing revolution in Syria, for example, the incidents now in Egypt and so forth, people are looking for more than rhetoric. They're looking for actual action being taken. And this is why Erdogan has become largely unpopular with the Syrian revolutionaries, right? That they said, okay, enough rhetoric, and they ended up instead of calling upon Erdogan and calling upon leaders in the Muslim world, now their slogan is the only one we have is Allah, malna ghayrak ya Allah. Correct? They have cut their hope, right? They have lost hope in the so-called Muslim leaders and so forth. To the extent that even when Turkey was attacked on its own soil, right, and 60 Turkish citizens were killed, Erdogan could not do anything about it. Even though Syria, the neighboring Syrian regime, even though he had openly stated that it was pro-Assad militants, right, which had carried out the attack on Turkish soil. So, because the Ummah's benchmark is rising, right, above that of rhetoric, and because the Turkish model is the popularity of the Turkish model is based largely on Erdogan's charisma, Erdogan's rhetoric, this makes it a very unstable pillar of popularity. Secondly, what about the economic miracle? What about the economic success? Quite simply, right, the policies pursued by Erdogan, what we call aggressive capitalism, polarizes the social classes in Turkey. And an example of this, if we look at the recent protests in Turkey, one of the key participants, right, of these protests were the workers' unions, the teachers, the factory workers, and so forth. Why? Because there's an increasing polarization between the upper middle class in Turkey and between the lower class, and this polarization is growing, right? So one, the so-called economic miracle is no miracle to begin with, and it's unsustainable because it's creating a polarization and these antagonisms in Turkey, which are exasperating and making the protests all the more violent. Two, the economic success of Erdogan and of the AKP cannot be copied and generalized over into the Arab world, because there are certain economic assets which are unique to Turkey. For example, its position between Europe and Central Asia, its strong manufacturing basis, right? Its strong manufacturing base, which was established before the AKP came into power, and as I said, a pre-existing economic framework. So when the AKP came into power, they did not come in. They were not dealing with a tottering economy. They were dealing with a stable economy, right? To which they opened up to the liberal market. Whereas the economies in the Muslim world, in the Arab Muslim world, are far different in terms of its economic assets, its geostrategic locations, and so forth. So just to summarize again, and this is very simple because the reality on the ground, especially the nature of the recent protests, make it all the more clear why the Turkish model and economic miracle is unsustainable. As we said, one, it is short-lived because it's based on aggressive capitalism, and capitalist policies are always based on a cycle, right? Are based on their life expectancy is always very short, and we saw this with the tiger economies in Southeast Asia and so forth. Two, it's creating polarization, antagonisms inside of Turkey, right? And this is expressed openly by the unions which are protesting against Erdogan, against the AKP. And three, the economic assets of Turkey are very different than those of the Arab Muslim world, and the Turkish economic model cannot be generalized into the Arab Muslim world. So, after having reviewed the function of the AKP and of the Turkish model, i.e. the continuation of economic and intellectual colonial and political colonialism, right, under the masquerade of moderate Islam or democratic Islam, the unsustainable pillars of the Turkish model's popularity and the Turkish model's economic success, and this paradox of representation where on one hand you adopt the liberating this liberating Islamic identity, and on the other hand a neo-colonial policy which is made to subordinate the Muslim world to the West, right? This paradox also creates a unsustainable paradox of representation, right? We can come to conclude, objectively speaking, independently of who we affiliate with ideologically, that the Turkish model is unsustainable in the Muslim world, and we should be all the more suspicious and all the more vocally critical of this policy if we were to take our ideological affiliation into into concern in that the Turkish model is being promoted as an alternative to the real Islamic mode of governance. What the West is trying to promote is an Islam which is a domesticated Islam, an Islam which fits into the parameters of the nation state, of the colonial nation state, a Islam which is relativized, right, a relative domesticated Islam which is subordinated to the universal values of liberal democracy, right? So democracy is made universal, Islam is made domestic. It is a quote unquote we call a Turkish Islam. Two, they are promoting an apolitical Islam, a Islam which has no political system, an Islam which has some general and some very broad political objectives, right, and maqasid such as justice and so forth. However, the content of these values, justice and so forth, are filled and defined by neoliberalism and so forth. And thirdly, they want a capitalist-friendly Islam, an Islam which is passive towards the policies, the aggressive policies of neoliberal economy, and a continuously aggressive United States. We will suffice with this, inshallah ta'ala, and if you guys have any questions, we'll take the questions, inshallah ta'ala. وصلى اللهم وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.